There is a kind of person who walks into a crowded room, looks around, and quietly decides they would rather be somewhere else. Not because they are broken, not because something went wrong in their life, but because their mind works differently from most people around them. Science has been studying this type of person for decades, and what researchers keep finding is shocking. The people who genuinely prefer to be alone, who choose silence over small talk and solitude over social events, are not the ones with problems. They are often the ones with the rarest and most powerful mental traits that exist in human psychology. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what those traits are, why they make these people so different, and most importantly, whether you are one of them without even knowing it. Most people have been told their whole lives that wanting to be alone is a red flag. Parents worry, friends ask what is wrong. Society has spent generations treating solitude like a symptom of something that needs to be fixed. But the research tells a completely different story. People who are genuinely comfortable being alone, who actually prefer it, tend to score higher in emotional intelligence, creative thinking, self-awareness, and long-term decision-making. These are not small advantages. These are the exact qualities that separate people who live deeply meaningful lives from those who spend their entire existence chasing noise and distraction, just to avoid sitting with themselves for 5 quiet minutes. Now, here is something that most people miss entirely. There is a massive difference between being lonely and preferring solitude. Loneliness is painful. It is the feeling of wanting connection and not having it. But choosing solitude is something else entirely. It is a conscious, deliberate preference for your own company. It is finding more value in one deep conversation than in 10 shallow ones. It is understanding that your inner world is rich enough to spend time in without needing constant external stimulation to feel alive. The people who have truly mastered this are operating on a different level, and psychology has a lot to say about why. So let us talk about the first of these 5 rare traits. The first thing that stands out about people who prefer solitude is that they have an unusually deep relationship with their own thoughts. Most people are actually afraid of their own minds. That sounds extreme, but think about it. Why do people immediately reach for their phones the second they are alone? Why does silence feel uncomfortable to so many adults? Because the moment the outside noise stops, the inside noise starts, and most people have never been taught how to handle that. But the person who genuinely enjoys being alone has learned to sit with their thoughts without panicking. They have built a kind of inner infrastructure that allows them to process emotions, reflect on experiences, and work through problems in real time, inside their own head, without needing to outsource that process to someone else. Psychologist Esther Buchholz, who spent years studying the human need for solitude, argued that being alone is not the opposite of connection. It is actually what makes deep connection possible. Her research suggested that people who never spend time alone never truly develop a strong sense of self. They become mirrors for the people around them, constantly adjusting their identity based on who they are with. But the person who spends real time alone begins to understand who they actually are beneath all the social performance. And that self-knowledge, that clarity about your own values, desires, and reactions is extraordinarily rare. Think about someone like a seasoned novelist, the kind of writer who has produced work that genuinely changes how readers see the world. Almost universally, when you read interviews with those kinds of writers, they describe long periods of intentional solitude as essential to their process, not just for the writing itself, but for the thinking that makes the writing possible. They are not retreating from life, they are going deeper into it, and that depth, that willingness to sit alone with uncomfortable questions until real answers emerge, is exactly what produces work that resonates with millions of people. Here is where it gets really interesting, and this is something you probably have never heard explained this way before. When a person becomes truly comfortable in solitude, they stop needing external validation to feel secure. This is huge. The vast majority of human behavior is driven by the need for approval from others. People choose careers based on what their family will think. They stay in relationships that do not serve them because they are afraid of being judged for leaving. They say yes to things they do not want to do because the discomfort of disappointing someone feels unbearable. But the person who has spent real time alone, who has developed a genuine relationship with their own judgment and values, starts to lose that dependency. They can make decisions based on what is actually true for them, rather than on what will make other people comfortable. That independence is the second rare trait, and it shows up in ways that other people sometimes find hard to understand. A person who has become genuinely self-directed in their choices can seem strange to those around them. They might quit a stable job to pursue something uncertain. They might end a long-term relationship that looks fine from the outside, but feels empty on the inside. They might move to a new city, change direction completely, or say no to something that everyone else is saying yes to. And when asked to explain, they often cannot fully articulate why in a way that satisfies the people asking. But internally, There is a clarity driving those choices that comes directly from time spent alone with themselves. They have done the inner work that makes authentic decision-making possible. Research from the University of Rochester confirms this pattern. Studies conducted there found that people who regularly spent time alone, and who did so by choice rather than circumstance, reported significantly higher levels of autonomy and self-determination than those who avoided solitude. They were more likely to pursue goals that were intrinsically motivated, meaning goals they genuinely cared about, rather than goals driven by external reward or social pressure. That distinction matters more than most people realize. A life built on intrinsic motivation feels fundamentally different from one built on what others expect. One feels like yours. The other feels like a performance you can never stop giving. Now, stay with this, because what comes next is the trait that probably surprises people the most. The third rare quality found in people who prefer solitude is an unusually high capacity for creative thinking. And the reason for this is deeply rooted in neuroscience. There is a part of the brain called the default mode network. This network becomes most active when you are not focused on external tasks. When you are daydreaming, reflecting, imagining, or simply being quiet, that network lights up. And what researchers have found is that the default mode network is responsible for some of the most sophisticated mental functions that humans possess, including self-reflection, empathy, creative problem-solving, and the ability to project yourself into future scenarios and make long-term plans. Here is the problem. That network cannot activate fully when you are constantly stimulated from the outside. Every notification, every conversation, every piece of content you consume is actually suppressing the activity of the default mode network, which means that people who fill every moment with external stimulation are literally preventing their brains from doing some of the most important work they are capable of. People who regularly seek solitude, on the other hand, are giving their default mode network space to operate. They are allowing the brain to make connections, generate ideas, and process experiences in ways that simply cannot happen in the middle of constant noise. A concrete example of this is what researchers call the incubation effect in creative problem solving. This is well documented in psychological research. When people work intensely on a problem and then step away into a period of quiet, unstructured time, they very often arrive at solutions that were not accessible when they were actively thinking about the problem. The answer appears while they are taking a walk, sitting quietly, or doing something simple and repetitive that does not demand focused attention. That phenomenon is the default mode network doing its job, and people who are comfortable with solitude are giving it the conditions it needs to work. People who avoid silence are shutting it down before it ever gets started. Think about the most creative person you know personally, not famous, just someone in your own life who seems to consistently come up with original ideas, who sees solutions where others see dead ends, who makes connections between things that most people would never link together. There is a very strong chance that person spends meaningful time alone, not because creativity requires suffering or isolation, but because creativity requires space. It requires a mind that has been allowed to wander without immediately being redirected towards something externally demanded of it. And solitude is how that space gets created. This brings up something that deserves its own moment in this video. Society has done a very poor job of distinguishing between the kind of aloneness that is healthy and generative and the kind that is destructive and numbing. A person who chooses solitude and uses that time to think, create, reflect, and recharge is doing something profoundly valuable. A person who isolates out of fear, avoidance, or depression is in a different situation entirely. The research that celebrates the benefits of solitude is consistently talking about the first kind, chosen solitude with intention and awareness, not withdrawal driven by pain or disconnection. Understanding that distinction is important because it allows people who genuinely love being alone to stop apologizing for it, while also being honest with themselves if aloneness is masking something that deserves attention. The fourth rare trait is one that quietly shapes every relationship that people who prefer solitude choose to have. That trait is the capacity for unusually deep and selective connection. This might sound counterintuitive. How does someone who prefers to be alone end up being better at connection? But the logic becomes clear when you look at the research. People who are comfortable alone do not need relationships to fill a void. They enter relationships from a position of genuine choice rather than desperate need. And that changes everything about the quality of those relationships. When someone needs constant company to feel okay, they will tolerate a lot in relationships that they probably should not. They will keep friendships alive that have long since stopped being nourishing. They will stay in conversations that drain them because the alternative feels worse. They will accept relationships built on convenience or habit rather than real mutual care and understanding. But the person who is genuinely satisfied in their own company makes very different choices. They are not collecting acquaintances to fill their schedule. They are investing deeply in a small number of relationships that they actually value. And those relationships tend to be stronger, more honest, and more lasting than the wide, shallow social network that most people accumulate out of habit or fear. Psychologist Harriet Lerner, whose work on relationships has been widely studied and cited, wrote extensively about the idea that the healthiest relationships are built between two people who each have a strong individual identity. When both people in a relationship know who they are, what they value, and what they need, the relationship can be built on genuine compatibility rather than mutual dependency. But that kind of individual clarity almost always requires time spent alone. It requires knowing yourself well enough to know what you actually want from another person, which is information you cannot access when you are constantly surrounded by other people's needs and opinions. This explains a pattern that researchers have observed repeatedly. People who enjoy solitude tend to report higher satisfaction in the relationships they do have. Not more relationships, not a more active social life, but deeper satisfaction with the connections they choose to maintain. Because they are choosing those connections deliberately, not out of loneliness or social anxiety or habit, but because they genuinely value what those specific people bring to their lives. That is a completely different foundation for a relationship, and it produces completely different outcomes. Here is the retention point that ties everything together before we get to the fifth trait, and the fifth one is arguably the most powerful of all. Everything discussed so far, the deep self-knowledge, the autonomous decision-making, the creative capacity, the selectivity in relationships, all of it connects to a single underlying quality that runs through the psychology of people who prefer solitude. That quality is what researchers sometimes call psychological interiority. It means having a rich, active, and developed inner life. A mental and emotional world that is interesting enough, complex enough, and rewarding enough to actually want to spend time in. This is not something everyone has. In fact, most people have been so consistently outward-focused throughout their lives that their inner world is genuinely underdeveloped. They have never had to build it because they have always been able to avoid it. But the person who regularly seeks solitude builds that interior world deliberately, even if they do not consciously realize that is what they are doing. Every time they sit with a difficult emotion, instead of distracting themselves from it, they are building psychological strength. Every time they work through a complex thought to its conclusion, instead of abandoning it for something easier, they are building intellectual depth. Every time they choose to be alone with their own experience of life, instead of constantly seeking someone else to interpret it for them, they are building a kind of self-sufficiency that has enormous practical value in the real world. Now, for the fifth trait, and this one deserves the most attention, because it is the one that connects most directly to how people who prefer solitude actually navigate the challenges of real life. The fifth rare quality is a high tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. Most people find uncertainty deeply uncomfortable. The brain is wired to resolve uncertainty as quickly as possible, because from an evolutionary standpoint, uncertainty meant potential danger. So humans have a built-in drive to reach conclusions, to know where they stand, to reduce the open loops and unanswered questions in their experience. And when that need is very strong, it makes people vulnerable to bad decisions. It makes them settle for answers that are quick and comfortable, rather than waiting for answers that are actually true. People who prefer solitude have, often through long practice, developed a much higher tolerance for sitting with open questions. They have spent enough time alone with uncertainty that they have learned it does not kill you. The discomfort of not knowing is survivable, and waiting for real clarity is almost always worth more than rushing to a false resolution just to make the discomfort stop. This shows up in practical ways that are easy to observe. People with high ambiguity tolerance make better long-term decisions. They are less likely to panic during periods of instability. They are more able to gather full information before committing to a course of action. They are less easily manipulated by fear or urgency because they have enough inner stability to slow down when everything around them is pushing them to speed up. There is a study from psychology worth knowing here. Research on what is called need for cognitive closure, which is essentially the degree to which a person needs to reach definitive answers and avoid uncertainty, consistently shows that people with high need for cognitive closure make faster decisions but worse ones. They tend to rely more heavily on stereotypes and first impressions. They are less open to new information that contradicts what they already believe, and they are significantly more likely to experience regret over important decisions because they rush to conclusions that did not hold up over time. People with lower need for cognitive closure, which strongly correlates with comfort in solitude, demonstrate the opposite pattern. Slower decisions, yes, but more accurate ones, more adaptable ones, and less regret. This tolerance for not knowing is partly why people who prefer solitude so often end up doing unusually well in fields that require deep analysis, long-term thinking, or creative exploration. Whether it is research, writing, entrepreneurship, engineering, or any domain where the best outcomes require sustained focus and comfort with complexity, The capacity to sit with uncertainty without flinching is an enormous asset. And it is an asset that gets built, not born with. It develops through the repeated experience of being alone with questions that do not yet have answers, and discovering that the process of staying present with those questions eventually leads somewhere real. Let us pause on something that has probably been building in your mind as you have been listening to this. If you recognize yourself in any of these traits, if you have always found more energy in solitude than in crowds, if you have always valued depth over breadth in your relationships, if you have always felt a pull toward your own internal experience rather than constant external activity, there is something important to understand about that. You have probably spent a significant amount of your life receiving messages that those qualities are weaknesses. Society is built for extroverts, schools reward participation in groups, workplaces celebrate the people who are always visible, always on, always available. The cultural narrative around success is almost always a social one, full of networking and collaboration, and building a room full of people who know your name. But the research does not support the idea that this is the only path to a meaningful or successful life. In fact, the research increasingly suggests that the qualities associated with genuine comfort in solitude are the same qualities associated with some of the deepest forms of human flourishing, not louder flourishing, not more socially visible flourishing, but the kind that actually produces wisdom, creativity, authentic connection, and a life that feels like it belongs to the person living it. That is not a small thing. That is arguably the most important thing. There is a moment in the life of most people who genuinely prefer solitude when they stop trying to fix themselves and start recognizing their own nature for what it actually is. That moment tends to be quiet. It is not a dramatic shift. It is just the gradual understanding that the way they experience the world is not a defect to be corrected, but a design to be understood, and that understanding changes how they move through the world. They stop spending energy on social situations that drain them, and start directing that energy toward the things that genuinely feed them. They stop apologizing for needing time alone, and start protecting that time with appropriate seriousness. They stop measuring their social life against some external standard of what is normal, and start building a life that fits the actual person they are. Clinical psychologist Elaine Arendt, a Tortavija, whose research on what she called the highly sensitive person became one of the most important contributions to modern personality psychology, documented extensively how individuals with heightened sensitivity to internal and external stimuli tend to require more alone time than average as a basic psychological need, not a preference or a luxury. Her work showed that approximately 20% of the population has a nervous system that processes information more deeply than average, noticing subtleties, making connections, and experiencing sensory and emotional input more intensely. These individuals are not introverts by choice. Their biology makes solitude necessary for regulation. And when they do not get enough of it, they do not just feel tired. They become genuinely dysregulated, anxious, overwhelmed, and less capable of functioning well in any domain. What is remarkable about this research is not just the finding itself, but what it implies. If a significant portion of the population has a neurological need for solitude that most social structures completely ignore or actively penalize, then millions of people have been spending their entire lives trying to conform to a model of social engagement that literally does not work with how their brain and nervous system are built. And the toll of that effort is enormous. The anxiety, the chronic exhaustion, the persistent feeling of being wrong or broken, the years spent trying to become more social, more outgoing, more comfortable in crowds, when the actual problem was never that they were broken, but that they were operating in conditions that were fundamentally incompatible with their nature. This is the deeper truth behind all 5 of these traits. They are not just personality characteristics. They are signals. They are signs that a person's psychology is oriented in a particular direction, inward rather than outward, and that orientation, when it is understood and honored rather than fought and suppressed, produces qualities that are genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. The deep self-knowledge that comes from spending real time alone. The autonomy that develops when you stop outsourcing your sense of self to other people's opinions. The creative capacity that emerges when you give the brain the quiet it needs to do its best work. The quality of connection that becomes possible when you are choosing it freely rather than out of fear. And the tolerance for uncertainty that grows when you practice sitting with hard questions long enough to find real answers. There is one more dimension to this that brings everything together, and it is the one that most people miss, because it requires seeing these 5 traits not as separate qualities, but as parts of a single, coherent way of being in the world. People who prefer solitude are at their core people who have developed a fundamental trust in their own inner experience. That sounds simple, but it is actually one of the most psychologically sophisticated things a person can do. Most people have been trained, often from childhood, to look outside themselves for signals about how to feel, what to think, and who to be. They learn to read the room before they learn to read themselves. They learn to manage other people's emotions before they learn to understand their own. And that training, while socially functional in many ways, leaves a deep disconnection between who a person actually is and how they actually live. The person who seeks solitude is often, consciously or not, trying to close that gap. They are trying to find their way back to something genuine about themselves that gets lost in the constant negotiation of social life. Every hour spent alone is an hour of recovering contact with their actual experience, their actual thoughts, their actual responses to the world. And over time, that contact becomes the foundation for everything else. The decisions become clearer, the relationships become more honest, the creative work becomes more original, the tolerance for difficulty becomes greater. Not because being alone is magical, but because knowing yourself well is one of the most practical advantages a human being can have. Psychology has a term for the outcome of this process when it develops fully. It is called self-actualization, a concept introduced by Abraham Maslow in his famous hierarchy of human needs. Maslow placed self-actualization at the very top of his pyramid, above safety, belonging, and esteem, as the ultimate form of human psychological development. And what did Maslow say about self-actualized individuals? He described them as comfortable with solitude, deeply ethical and autonomous in their thinking, highly creative, capable of deep, meaningful relationships with a small circle of people, resistant to cultural conformity, highly perceptive, and able to see through surface appearances to the underlying reality of situations, comfortable with uncertainty and the unknown, and able to find profound meaning in ordinary experiences. In other words, the psychological portrait of the self-actualized person that Maslow painted from his research looks almost exactly like the portrait of someone who genuinely prefers being alone. That is not a coincidence. It reflects something real about the relationship between solitude, self-knowledge, and the highest forms of human development. The world needs different kinds of people. It needs those who thrive in crowds and those who thrive in quiet. It needs the networkers and the deep thinkers. It needs the performers and the reflectors. But for a very long time, one of those types has been told it is the lesser one, that the person who goes home early from the party and feels genuinely better for it is missing something. That the person who prefers a long walk alone over brunch with 20 people needs to work on themselves. That the person who needs silence to think is somehow less equipped for life than the person who processes everything out loud in real time. The evidence does not support that story, and understanding that, really understanding it, not just intellectually, but in a way that changes how you see yourself and how you live your life, is what the research on solitude ultimately offers. Not permission to isolate, not a justification for avoiding all the challenges and discomforts that real human connection brings with it, but clarity about the genuine value of a particular way of being in the world that has been underestimated for far too long. If you are someone who has spent years wondering why you are not more like the extroverts around you, why social situations exhaust you when they seem to energize everyone else, why you feel most like yourself when you are alone, and least like yourself when you are surrounded by people, what you have learned here should reframe that experience entirely. You are not lacking something. You are not behind on some developmental task that everyone else already completed. You are not broken in some subtle way that other people have politely decided not to mention. You are someone with a particular psychological architecture, one that produces rare and valuable traits when it is understood and cultivated, rather than fought and suppressed. And the 5 qualities that come with that architecture, the deep relationship with your own thoughts, the autonomy in decision-making, the creative capacity unlocked by silence, the depth and selectivity in your relationships, and the tolerance for uncertainty that makes real wisdom possible, these are not consolation prizes for people who could not manage to be more social. They are genuine strengths. They are the kinds of strengths that, throughout human history, have produced the thinking, the art, the philosophy, the science, and the leadership that shape civilization. The question is never whether your nature is right or wrong. The question is whether you understand it well enough to work with it rather than against it. And if this video has done its job, that understanding is a little bit clearer now than it was when you pressed play. Let us go even deeper, because there are aspects of this psychological reality that rarely get discussed in mainstream conversations about personality, and they deserve real attention. One of the most misunderstood things about people who prefer solitude is how they experience time. Most people experience time as something external, something that happens to them, structured by schedules, obligations, and the demands of other people. But people who spend significant time alone tend to develop a very different relationship with time. They begin to experience it as something they inhabit rather than something they manage. They become capable of what psychologists call deep present moment awareness, which simply means being genuinely absorbed in what they are doing rather than half present while mentally tracking 20 other things. This is not a mystical concept, it is a cognitive one. Research on what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging and meaningful activity, consistently shows that flow is far more accessible to people who have developed comfort with solitude and internal focus. Flow states are associated with peak performance, peak creativity, and the highest reports of moment-to-moment well-being in psychological research. And the primary condition required for flow is the ability to give sustained, undivided attention to a single thing without the pull of social monitoring, which is the mental habit of constantly tracking how you appear to others, disrupting that focus. People who prefer solitude are, almost by definition, less engaged in social monitoring. They have less of their mental bandwidth committed to managing impressions, reading social cues, and adjusting their presentation in real time. That frees up an enormous amount of cognitive capacity for actual engagement with actual tasks. The result is that when they work, they tend to work with a depth of focus that is genuinely unusual. When they think, they tend to think with a thoroughness that most people, whose attention is constantly fragmented by social concerns, simply cannot match. And when they create, they tend to produce work that has a quality of internal consistency and original vision that comes directly from that freedom from external performance. Here is a dimension that is worth sitting with for a moment. The way that people who prefer solitude handle failure and setbacks is genuinely different from the way that socially dependent people handle those same experiences. For someone whose sense of self is largely external, built from the reflection they see in other people's eyes, failure is catastrophic. It does not just mean something went wrong, it means they are wrong. It means the image they have been carefully constructing in other people's minds has been damaged. And repairing that damage becomes the primary focus, often at the expense of actually learning from what happened and doing better the next time. For someone who has spent real time building an internal sense of self, failure is painful, but it is not identity threatening in the same way. They can separate what happened from who they are. They can examine the failure honestly, extract what is useful from it, and move forward without the need to perform recovery for an audience. This produces a capacity for genuine resilience that is not just emotional toughness, but actual learning from adversity. Research consistently shows that people who are able to process difficult experiences through internal reflection, rather than primarily through social performance, which is what solitude actually makes possible, show greater growth following challenges, greater adaptability in future situations, and greater stability over the long arc of their lives. Think about the difference between two people who both experience a significant professional failure. One person immediately needs to talk to everyone about it, partly to process but also partly to manage how the failure is being perceived. They need reassurance from others that they are still valued, still competent, still respected. The other person goes quiet. They spend time alone with what happened. They resist the urge to immediately reframe or justify or seek comfort. They let themselves feel the full weight of it, and then they start working through it analytically, asking what actually went wrong, what their role in it was, and what they would do differently. Both people are dealing with pain, but only one of them is actually extracting the full value from the experience. And that process of honest internal accounting is almost impossible to do in the middle of a social performance. It requires solitude. It requires the willingness to be alone with an uncomfortable truth long enough to understand it. This connects to something in moral philosophy that is worth understanding in psychological terms. The ancient practice of what Stoic philosophers called self-examination, the daily habit of reviewing your thoughts, actions, and motivations honestly and without self-serving distortion, was considered by thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca to be the foundation of genuine virtue and practical wisdom, not because examining yourself was painful as a form of punishment, but because clarity about your own nature, your own weaknesses, your own patterns, was the prerequisite for choosing actions that were actually aligned with your values, rather than driven by impulse, fear, or the desire for approval. That practice is essentially what people who prefer solitude do naturally. Maybe not in the formal philosophical sense, but in the functional one. They spend time alone with the question of who they are and how they are living, and they develop honest answers to that question over time. That honesty is protective. It makes them harder to manipulate, because they know their own vulnerabilities. It makes them more consistent, because their behavior flows from an internalized value system rather than from social pressure. It makes them more trustworthy, because they are not performing a version of themselves for different audiences, but actually being the same person in most contexts, the person they know themselves to be when no one else is watching. There is a psychological term for this consistency between private and public self, and research shows it is one of the strongest predictors of psychological well-being over a lifetime. People who behave very differently when they are alone versus when they are observed tend to experience higher rates of anxiety, lower self-esteem, and greater difficulty forming trusting relationships. Because at some level they know there is an inconsistency at the center of how they present themselves to the world, and that inconsistency is exhausting to maintain and destabilizing to live with. People who are the same in public as they are in private, whose values and behavior remain consistent regardless of who is watching, tend to report feeling more at peace with themselves and more connected to a genuine sense of purpose. Building that kind of integrity, that consistency between inner and outer life, requires knowing yourself, and knowing yourself requires spending real time alone with yourself. It is not complicated as a concept. It is simply difficult as a practice. Because everything in modern life is engineered to pull you away from that inner encounter and toward external stimulation. That is easier, more immediately rewarding, and far less demanding of genuine self-confrontation. Let us talk about what this all means for the future, because there is an argument to be made that the traits associated with genuine comfort in solitude are going to become even more valuable, not less, as the world continues to change at the pace it is currently changing. We are living in an era of unprecedented information overload, social fragmentation, and constant stimulation. The average adult now encounters more distinct pieces of information in a single day than a person living 3 centuries ago would have encountered in an entire month. The pace of change in every domain, technological, political, social, economic, is accelerating in ways that have no historical precedent. And the pressures that come with this environment, the anxiety, the cognitive overwhelm, the difficulty making decisions in the face of conflicting information, the sense of being perpetually behind and perpetually reactive, are being felt by virtually everyone. In this context, the abilities that define people who are comfortable in solitude are not just personally valuable, they are strategically valuable. The ability to filter signal from noise, to sit with a complex problem until a real answer emerges, rather than grabbing the first plausible one, to resist being swept up in collective panic or collective enthusiasm, to maintain a stable sense of self and purpose even when the external environment is chaotic and uncertain. These abilities are exactly what the current moment demands, and they are exactly the abilities that develop from regular intentional time spent alone. There is research from organizational psychology that makes this point in a business context. Studies of decision-making under pressure consistently show that the most effective leaders in fast-changing, high-stakes environments are not the ones who are most socially connected or most responsive to their environment in the moment. They are the ones who maintain what researchers call strategic patience, the ability to absorb large amounts of information, tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty, and wait for genuine clarity before committing to action. That quality is almost impossible to develop without a practice of solitude. It is the product of a mind that has learned, through repeated experience, that the discomfort of not yet knowing is worth enduring because the clarity that comes from waiting is far more valuable than the false comfort of a premature conclusion. This is why so many of the people throughout history who made genuinely original contributions to human understanding, in science, philosophy, art, and leadership, had a practice of solitude at the center of their lives. Not because great thinkers are misanthropes who hate people. Most of them loved people deeply and cared enormously about humanity. But they understood intuitively what psychology has since confirmed empirically, that certain kinds of thinking, the kind that produces genuinely new understanding rather than just recombining existing ideas, can only happen in conditions of quiet, sustained attention. And quiet, sustained attention is exactly what solitude provides. Now, something worth acknowledging before we close is the social cost that often comes with this preference for solitude, because it is real and it should not be minimized. People who genuinely prefer to be alone often pay a price for that preference in their relationships, their careers, and their sense of belonging in a world that is structured around social participation. They miss out on the networking that opens certain professional doors. They sometimes struggle to maintain connections with people who interpret their need for alone time as rejection or indifference. They may feel genuinely out of step with a social world that treats constant availability as both normal and desirable, and navigating that gap between how they naturally are and what the social environment expects of them takes real energy and real skill. The answer to that challenge is not to suppress the preference or pretend it does not exist. The research is clear that trying to be fundamentally different from your psychological nature is not just ineffective, but actively harmful. It produces chronic stress, reduced performance, and the specific kind of unhappiness that comes from living inauthentically. The better answer is understanding the nature clearly enough to work with it skillfully, knowing when and how to engage socially in ways that are genuine and valuable. Knowing when to protect solitude without apology, because the work that happens in that solitude is worth protecting. Being able to explain your own needs clearly enough to the people who matter, that they can understand what your withdrawal means and what it does not mean. That skill, the ability to know yourself clearly enough to advocate for your own psychological needs, while also remaining genuinely open to the needs and perspectives of others, is itself a product of the very traits we have been discussing. It requires self-knowledge. It requires autonomy. It requires the capacity for deep and honest connection. It requires tolerance for the ambiguity that comes with any relationship between two genuinely different people. It is, in other words, the integration of everything this video has been about. Not the rejection of human connection in favor of solitude, but the deep enough understanding of yourself to bring your whole, honest, developed self to the connections you choose to make. The people who learn to live this way, who honor their solitude without isolating, who connect deeply without losing themselves, who build lives that are genuinely organized around their actual nature, rather than around what they were told they should want, tend to describe their experience of life in particular terms. They use words like grounded, purposeful, real. They talk about a sense of being in their life rather than performing it. They describe relationships that feel honest and chosen rather than obligatory and exhausting. They talk about work that comes from somewhere genuine inside them rather than from external pressure and expectation. And they talk about a relationship with themselves that is, if not always comfortable, at least honest, at least real, at least theirs. That is what the 5 traits discussed in this video, taken together and developed over time, actually produce. Not a perfect life, not a life free of difficulty or loneliness or the specific ache that comes from being wired differently from most of the people around you, but a life that is genuinely yours, a life built from the inside out rather than from the outside in. And in a world where so much pressure exists to conform, to perform, to optimize for external approval and social visibility, that kind of life, quiet as it may look from the outside, is among the rarest and most courageous things a person can build. Every person who has ever chosen a long walk alone over a crowded social event, who has ever felt the specific relief of coming home to silence after hours of social engagement, who has ever found that their best ideas and their clearest sense of themselves only emerge when no one else is in the room, has been living these truths without perhaps having the language for them. This is that language. And the hope is that it helps. Because understanding why you are the way you are is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of using that knowledge to build something that actually works, something that fits the actual person you are, rather than the person you were told you should be. And that, ultimately, is what psychology at its best has always been for.